Good morning, everybody. As Jackie said, one of the significant changes in the new student misconduct policy is a move to regard restorative justice as a kind of default option. So in every case where it's appropriate, decision makers are encouraged or in a sense required to consider using a restorative approach. And so what I would like to do is, I guess, give you a little bit of a snapshot of what we mean by this term restorative justice, where it's come from, what its distinctive features are, what we've done thus far at Victoria to sort of move in this direction. So it's a bit of a kind of an educational thing. I'm not going to talk about the policy as such. I'm going to really just talk about the world that the policy is inviting us now to participate in. And hopefully that will give us a kind of philosophy for proceeding, because those of us who work in this field, one of the things that we are most concerned about is that restorative justice gets reduced to a process, and that the deeper values, the deeper sort of understandings, deeper philosophical commitments that lie behind it don't necessarily get recognised. And what international experience shows is that especially when it's taken over by agents of the state, is that it gets reduced to a kind of bureaucratic process and loses its power and its magic. So I've personally been involved in the restorative justice field, both from an academic perspective and also from a practitioner perspective, for about 25 years or so. And my boat came home in 2013 when, after a long process, the university here decided or agreed to create a new dedicated chair in restorative justice, which is funded through a partnership between the university and 6 or 7 government departments and 1 private trust. It's one of our partnership chairs, all of which I think are in the business school. The partnership agreement has no fewer than 12 different KPIs, which causes me to lose a bit of sleep at night, I must say. But I like to reduce them down to a very simple ambition for the chair, which is to work with academics, with policymakers and with practitioners to strengthen the quality and extend the reach of restorative justice processes in New Zealand and, for that matter, beyond. And for those of us who really do get excited and engaged by this idea, these are very exciting times to be doing this kind of work. A great deal is happening, especially in New Zealand, which has internationally been regarded as a trailblazer in the field. And it feels to me that there's something in the water at the moment, that there's a lot of really interesting things happening, a lot of interest being shown, a lot of quite innovative departures being made. The restorative justice movement really emerged in the early 1970s in North America, initially in Canada and then very soon after in the US. And it was initially focused entirely in the criminal justice arena. So restorative justice, as the name implies, was an initiative within the criminal justice system, the criminal justice process. But in the early 1990s, people began to extend the principles and values and priorities of restorative justice into schools. It was a kind of logical move because schools are a sort of society in miniature. And school communities have the same range of disciplinary issues, behaviour issues, relational issues as society at large. As restorative justice sort of moved into the educational sphere, there were a number of changes that took place, one of which was the kind of rebranding of the language. So rather than speaking of restorative justice, schools speak of restorative practices, because the language of justice, the language of victim and offender, isn't really appropriate when you're dealing with children in a school environment. At first, when restorative measures were introduced, they were introduced as a disciplinary tool, as a way of controlling or responding to misbehaviour. And one of the drivers behind this actually was the huge levels of concern, especially in the US, about the so-called school-to-prison pipeline. The recognition that kids who get expelled or suspended or somehow fall out of the education system will almost inexorably move towards being incarcerated as adults. And so there's a lot of concern to find alternatives, and restorative justice was seen as an alternative to more exclusionary forms of discipline. So it entered the school environment as a disciplinary measure. But it soon became obvious to schools that restorative justice methods would really only make a lasting difference in the lives of the kids and in the lives of the school as a whole, would only make a lasting difference if the entire school community undertook a kind of culture change in a restorative direction. That this stuff would make a difference if all the other relationships in the school between staff and students, between staff and other staff members, between the school and parents and so on, if all these other relationships were also quite consciously based on restorative values. And as schools have thought of what is entailed in creating a kind of restorative school community, they've come up with some really creative thinking and practices and produced, especially our own Ministry of Education here in New Zealand, produced some really wonderful resources. And for me, there is nothing more inspiring than to go into a school which is aspiring to be a restorative school. People say, I heard somebody, a senior person in the Ministry of Education say recently, that the first thing you notice, even when you're walking up the driveway into the school, is that the environment feels peaceful. There's a kind of sense of stability in the environment that you can just sense even before you've met people and talked to the school about what it's doing. However, much less has been happening in the tertiary education sector with regard to restorative processes. Though we are aiming to fix that in this university, and my hope really, and I'll come back to this later on, is that Victoria will sort of lead the way amongst New Zealand universities and really amongst universities around the world in trying to achieve what schools try to achieve, to create an entire sort of educational community based on these sorts of values and principles. Once again, in the US, some of the current interest that's being shown in restorative justice is being driven by the enormous concern that is mounting in the US about sexual assault on campus, and the recognition that the traditional ways of dealing with it, and in American institutions they're very much modelled on a kind of standard adversarial justice process, is both expensive and often very damaging, and particularly damaging for complainants. And it's often said that a woman student may lodge a complaint about sexual assault, and the person who ends up leaving the university is the complainant, not the person who's responsible for it. And there's been quite a lot in the press in the US about the potential of restorative justice to provide a way of responding to sexual assault on campus that perhaps would be more beneficial to all the parties. Now that's in many ways a really big area to tackle, and we're not talking about that here at this point. That's not the first thing you try to do when you start to use these practices. It's a very complex area, but it is a very important area for, at some point, for us all to consider and to continue to consider. Last year, I don't know who sponsored it, but showed the documentary The Hunting Ground, which is really quite alarming. About the extent to which sexual assault afflicts American campuses, and again the research would say it afflicts universities all around the world. But that's not where we're going to in the first instance. So what I've said then is that as restorative processes entered primary and secondary schools, it began as a disciplinary tool, but then morphed into a larger concern for changing the culture and climate of the institution as a whole. And I think the same kind of dynamic will hold true for tertiary institutions that want to move in this direction. Certainly restorative processes have an important role to play in student disciplinary regimes, and that's what we're going to be talking about for the rest of this time. But they also have a role to play in promoting student well-being in general, and particularly in halls of residence where students live cheek by jowl in a kind of community. Often their first time away from home, they're just out of school, they're getting used to the big bad world, getting used to studying and all the rest of it. And I also think that these processes have a role to play in improving staff well-being and contributing to our HR processes so that they become less damaging on people as well. And so the dream that I have had for the last few years, and which I've shared with senior leadership and with several others in the university, is that Victoria will sort of embark on this goal of becoming New Zealand's first restorative university. And what I mean by that is this. An institution where all the policies and practices that we have relating to students and to collegial relationships in general are grounded on and measured against restorative values and practices. Now, before I talk about how far we've come so far in this, I know journey is a terribly overused metaphor, but in this journey, let me just say a little bit more about what we mean by this term restorative justice, just very briefly, because I think this is quite important for us. As in most areas of scholarship, definitions are the most debated thing of all, but this one is as good as any, and I think highlights many of the important points. Restorative justice is a process whereby all the parties with a stake in a particular offence or conflict come together in a safe and controlled environment with trained facilitators to share their feelings and opinions truthfully and resolve together how best to promote repair and bring about positive changes for all involved. Coming together with trained facilitators to have a conversation about what's happened, what the impact has been, and how things can be repaired. There are lots of different tools available for achieving this coming together. Our youth justice system and our child protection system uses family group conferences as the model. The adult justice system uses what's sometimes victim-offender dialogue or victim-offender conferencing. Community panels are a kind of attempt to bring people together sometimes. Circle processes are used in schools. So there are lots of different kind of tools in the tool bag for achieving this coming together of people who've been affected by an offence. But what makes restorative justice so significant is not just the tools, but its kind of underlying philosophy of what it's trying to achieve. That's really what makes it different, and that's really, I think, what makes it significant. So here's one way of trying to crystallise the difference between this way of working and the conventional way of working. Now, this is very simple, but I have run, and I didn't invent these questions, I pinched them from somebody else. I have used this in speaking to a conference of 350 district court judges, and nobody stood up and said, no, that's far too simple, it's not like that at all. Fundamentally, our conventional justice system asks three questions. What laws have been broken? Who broke them? Who's to blame for breaking the law? And what punishment do they deserve? So our court system is fundamentally about those questions. If the first question is no laws have been broken, then there's nothing else that the court system can do. It's concerned about breaching of law, establishing culpability, and deciding on sanction. Restorative justice, by contrast, asks a different set of questions. It asks who has been hurt by what's happened, and what needs do they have? Who is responsible for causing the harm, and therefore what obligations do they have? And what can we do to put things right again? What can we do to restore? What can we do to repair? It's not enough to simply say we punish. Now, punishment may be part of the process, but in and of itself, punishment doesn't do anything to repair. Punishment is a symbolic marker of the wrongness of what's happened. And so if we want to move from simply saying that somebody is guilty of doing something significant to the question of, well, how do we pick up the pieces after that? Then we need to move on to the question of what do we do to put things right again. It would also ask what's caused the problem and how can we ensure it doesn't happen again. Now, as simple as it sounds, and in some ways as self-evident as those latter questions are, when you put it this way, you think, well, why don't we do this? Well, we don't. This is not the way we operate. We tend to operate solely in terms of moral responsibility and penalty. When you see it this simply, what it, I think, illustrates is that restorative justice is a different way of thinking about the problem, and therefore it suggests a different way of dealing with the problem. It's not just a set of pragmatic strategies, it's a distinctive way of thinking about the justice or the justice problem, or the problem of human conflict and wrongdoing. It's a new lens. That's a metaphor that was used in one of the first books in this field, and I always find it very helpful. You put a new lens on the camera, things look different. You look at this problem with a different lens on, with a restorative lens on, things look different, and the solutions look different. It's a new way of conceptualizing the justice problem based fundamentally on a relational understanding of justice. Restorative justice practice is grounded on the understanding of human persons as being fundamentally constituted by relationships. As human beings, we are irreducibly and inescapably relational beings. We cannot exist in splendid isolation. We only always exist as part of a dense network of relationships. And as a new grandfather, I have observed this all over again, that this little child is born into a complex network of relationships. His very existence and survival depends on those relationships. His very identity, his sense of self-worth, his learning, all of it is created by relationships. So it's not really an anthropology based on the Cartesian idea of I think, therefore I am, but rather I am connected to others, therefore I am. I am because I belong somewhere. I exist because you exist. Or perhaps most fundamentally, I matter because I matter to someone. My worth is validated by the fact that somebody else cares about me. Now, liberal theories of justice tend to view human actors as independent, autonomous agents who enter into these very thin relationships with each other on the basis of contract, an agreement to sort of do things for one another, largely to meet our self-interested needs. And most of our legal and social institutions are based on that assumption. And so, in fact, are most of our corrective or punitive strategies in the criminal justice system. So we assume in our correction system that we can deal to delinquent individuals by isolating them from the network of relationships that they belong to, perhaps because they're very unhealthy relationships, put them into another context where they create another set of very unhealthy relationships and try to fix them through, in a sense, through suffering. And then we will return them back and, hey presto, we've corrected them. And it seems to me the fundamental practice of isolating the person in the first place almost means you're defeated before you start. We had a wonderful lecture last week by a European criminologist who was talking about prison practice in Europe, and in Germany in particular. And within German legislation, there's this expectations that prisons will correspond to normal life as much as possible. So the principle of normalization is built into their corrective system. Go to Rimutaka prison and tell me if it feels normal. There is nothing normal about it. There's nothing that resembles life in responsible society. The sole goal of, and this may have problems, but we won't go there, the sole goal of incarceration in German law is to re-socialize the person to a crime-free life. So the rehabilitative ideal is built into it. Open prisons are favoured over closed prisons because of this common sense understanding that the more people are in contact, in relationship with people who are healthy and well and law-abiding, the more chance that they will be like that as well. So relational theory, by contrast, assumes that we are always formed, we are informed, we are sometimes deformed, but we are nearly always reformed through the quality of our relationships. And that's not simply an abstract normative claim. When you think about it, we are conceived in a relationship, we are born into relationships, you only ever survive in life because of relationships, and there is never a time in our life when we exist apart from relationships. As social creatures, we are relational beings all the way down. Now, some relationships are a source of good in our lives, and some relationships can be a source of harm in our lives. When relationships enable our flourishing and our well-being, we could say they are right relationships. They're good relationships. And I think it's possible to identify what makes a good relationship. This is what makes a good relationship. It is based on mutual respect, on freedom, on equality of value, and on a minimal shared trust that you will treat me in the way that you would want me to treat you, the golden rule. A healthy relationship, a right relationship, might not be a close relationship. Most of our relationships aren't close. But if our relationships are to be right, then they're based on respect, freedom, equality, and trust. Relationships that cause us harm are relationships that fail to respect our autonomy, our equality, our dignity, that fail to acknowledge our worth and our freedom. So restorative justice then thinks about justice not as the balancing of abstract rights and duties and interests, but as the existence of right relationships between people. Justice exists when relationships are characterized by respect, by freedom, by equality, by trust, by recognition of the other person's dignity. Similarly, restorative justice understands criminal offending not primarily as a breaking of rules or a transgressing of a moral or spiritual or cultural code, but even more fundamentally than that, as the harming of actual persons, the infliction of real personal losses on people, the tearing of the web of relationships that interconnect us in society, the dishonouring of the kind of relationship we ought to have with one another as fellow citizens, certainly, but even more fundamentally as fellow human beings. In short, restorative justice understands offending as injury more than infraction. As injury more than an infraction, and it understands justice as healing more than as penalty or as retributive balance, as restoring relationships to a condition of rightness, a recovery, an affirmation of respect, of dignity, of freedom, of value, and so on. Now, it makes little difference whether the damage has been caused by a criminal offence, which is a kind of culturally relative way of deciding some offences have a public interest in them and need to be separated out and dealt with in a more harsh way, whether it's a criminal offence or whether it's a non-criminal offence. The same principles apply. So when schools have introduced this into the educational environment, they speak of restorative discipline. And this is a quote from a book on restorative practices in school. And you can see the same ideas are present. Restorative discipline is a response to wrongdoing that focuses on repairing the harm caused by misbehaviour. It is a victim-centred response because it focuses on meeting the needs of those who have been hurt, as well as using the incident as a teachable moment for the one who has done the harm. Punitive discipline focuses heavily on dealing with the person who broke the rules. Restorative discipline focuses on meeting the needs both of those who have been harmed by the misbehaviour and the one who has committed the harm. So in both contexts, in both a criminal context, in an educational context, in a civil context, in an employment context, whatever the context is, a restorative approach is fundamentally concerned to clarify the harm that has been done and to find ways to repair the harm so that the relationship can be restored to a condition of rightness, not closeness necessarily, or affection, but a condition of rightness. How is this achieved? Well, it's achieved through a relational process that aims to bring together all those who've been affected by wrongdoing in a safe and controlled environment with trained facilitators. To do what? To name the wrong that has been done, to speak truthfully about what has happened, to describe how you have been personally affected by what has happened, the emotional, the moral, the material needs that have been created by the harm that has been done, and to resolve together, where both parties are engaged in the process, how best to repair the harm and to prevent recurrence. This same process, asking the same questions that I mentioned before, can be used and will be used in university disciplinary processes as well as in the criminal justice system. A restorative process for addressing harms, conflicts and failures involves a managed conversation to talk about what happened, what the harm has been, who is accountable for it, and how things can be repaired. So just to finish, let me very quickly talk about the journey that Victoria has been on over the last couple of years in this regard. A new student conduct policy is, in a sense, one of the markers on this journey, and it comes into force next week. And Jackie and Simon will talk more about that before. But essentially, it commits the university, wherever possible, to use a restorative processes for addressing harms and needs. So a restorative way of operating will become the kind of default option for dealing with general misconduct, and not with academic misconduct. We can talk about that later. And it will influence the way serious misconduct is handled as well. So we've got this disciplinary process, which is going to be our focus for the rest of the morning. But I do want to tell you about what's happening in the halls of residence. We have something like 3,000 students, is that right, Pam, in halls of residence? Four.
Nearly 4,000. No, just over 3,000. It's just over 3.
And the halls of residence management, the hall managers, the res life people, and people within the university management structures have made a commitment to start using restorative tools for dealing with problems that arise in the halls. And our team has been involved in several training workshops and seminars, including a 3-day training session for people to facilitate restorative conversations. And I have to say this is totally genuine. It's not because of people in the audience. I am so hugely impressed with the quality of staff we have in the halls of residents. They really are very fine and committed and intelligent people, and it's been an absolute pleasure to work with them. And what we've done with them is we've begun to forge this idea of residential halls functioning as restorative communities. And this is a kind of microcosm of what hopefully this is not just a utopian ideal, but I would like to see extended across the university as a 20,000 person community in general, a kind of microcosm and one of the pillars of being a restorative university. What does it mean for the halls to be working at creating restorative communities? If you go to the student handbook for the halls now, they'll say, we are a restorative community, and it describes what it means. But essentially, we've decided it has two sides to it. It includes proactive measures to build strong and inclusive and caring relationships between the residents so that conflict and misconduct are less likely to occur. Of course, they're going to occur. But common sense would say that when people have strong, caring relationships, they're less likely to do things that will harm one another. Now, the halls have always done fantastic things to create that sense of culture within the halls, balls and social events and other things like that. And as I said, both the staff and the RAs have been an enormous source of pleasure for me to watch them in action. In addition to that, we have advocated the use of what in schools are called circle processes to build connections between people. And I could speak for the rest of the morning about circles because I just find them just intellectually absolutely fascinating. But the use of a circle process where everybody, you sit in a circle and everybody has a turn to speak, to use these processes to clarify the norms and values that the hall wants to observe on its floor. How are we going to live together in a way? What do we expect of each other? What do we need from each other so that our time in this hall, our time at university is going to be the way we want it to be? Using those sort of processes as well to deal with conflicts that arise on the hall, on the floor at least. I think there's enormous potential to use them for dealing with traumatic events when something like a suicide happens or bereavement happens or serious illness happens. And so many of our therapeutic strategies, again, focus solely on the individual who's in need. But circle processes have a wonderful potential to build a sense of real therapeutic support for people. I think they could be used if even a person is expelled from a hall and then readmitted to a hall, to use what in corrections they could call a reintegration circle. An opportunity for people to actually participate together in creating this kind of inclusive, respectful, enjoyable community. And then the reactive measures, employing restorative processes when incidents of harmful behaviour or breach of conduct occur. Now, what does this mean? Well, I've already said what it means. It can operate at lots of different levels. I mean, it can just be a one-to-one conversation, which is angled at these sorts of questions. In more significant situations, it's very wise to bring in facilitators to run a conference process, or sometimes it could involve everybody who's been affected on the hall. But essentially, a restorative process is a facilitated conversation that asks these basic questions. What happened? A focus on the past, not just who's guilty, but what actually happened. Let's go back and tell the story about what happened. And in doing this work, one of the things that I've learned over and over again is never to prejudge things on the basis of paper statements. I don't know how many times I've read a summary of facts and I've made a whole range of judgments about what happened and about the moral character of the people who are involved, only to sit down and talk to them and find that things have, even when I was head of school, even dealing with academic misconduct, I found that to be true. Open and shut case, well, you have a conversation, let's tell me what happened. And so often you find things that you've never anticipated. What happened? A past focus. What's the impact been on what happened? Who has been affected negatively by what happened. That's a present focus. Let's look at how people are hurting as a result of what happened. How can things be repaired and made right again, and how can we prevent it from happening again? So it's a future focus. Past, present, and future focus. Now again, it sounds so obvious when you put it this way, but I've found from observation that structuring a conversation in this sort of way, let's start by just telling what happened. Let's then think about what the impact's been on you, who do you think else has been affected, and probing this level of impact. And then when that's done, moving around to the question, well, what needs to be done? I mean, what obligations do you have to try and put this right? What do you think will actually make a difference? Or what do you think will make a difference for you as the victim? I found when I was head of school talking to people who had conflicts with colleagues and they'd come to talk to me about it, and I'd say, well, what do you need for this to be better? And often they'd never thought about it. Never thought about what they need. They were so consumed with the indignity of what the person had done. And then moving to the future, there's something about this way of structuring a conversation when you're dealing with emotional harm that is powerfully transformative. And there must be a psychology behind this. I think it kind of mirrors the sort of emotional journey we always need to go on when we deal with personal harm. And as simple and as self-evident as this sounds, there's actually a skill to it that this belies. To help people go on this journey of clarifying the facts, thinking of impact, thinking of repair, and thinking about how it didn't happen again. Make sure it doesn't happen again. So these then are the twin legs of a restorative community, and I think the twin legs of a restorative university. A commitment to creating and sustaining respectful, caring, inclusive relationships. Our not strategic values, what do you call them? The university's values. Respect, compassion, what are they? I can't remember them now, but I mean, they're all restorative values. They're great, we all affirm them. Well, how do we actually operationalise them? Well, a restorative approach is a way of operationalising them so we create these caring and respectful relationships. And then the other side of it, the other leg, is this commitment to respond to harm and hurt by seeking to repair and heal, not simply to punish and exclude. To repair and to heal, and to use the relationships that are involved as the way of doing that. Last comment. There are, I think, when it comes to the student halls, and when it comes to schools, and I would suggest when it comes to any human community, whether it's a work community within your school or in your unit, workplace, whether it's an educational community, whatever, it seems to me there are three fundamental insights that we should always just keep in mind. Again, you'll recognise them and you'll think, why am I spending so much time talking about them? They're so obvious, but we tend to forget the most important things. First insight is this. Positive interpersonal relationships are a major influence on behaviour. Positive interpersonal relationships are a major influence on human behaviour. Because we are constitutionally, irreducibly social beings, we are wired to connect. The quality of our relationships matters. And when a kid starts to play up or to act out, often it's worth just tracking back to the question of what kind of interpersonal relationships do they have. Secondly, everybody wants and needs to belong. Everybody wants and needs to belong. Everybody wants and needs to be respected and cared for, to be trusted. Everybody wants to actually exercise responsibility. Everyone wants to feel that they matter. Everybody wants to love and to be loved. Everybody, even the most angular, difficult personality in your team, still wants to belong. Somebody has said, living together as if everyone belongs might be the biggest violence prevention measure ever devised. Everybody needs to belong. And then finally, everybody is responsible for their own actions and behaviour. We know that our behaviour is constrained by a whole range of things, by poverty, by class, by genetics, by family upbringing, by mental health conditions. There are lots of constraining factors. But a fundamental feature of human dignity is that people must be treated as though they are able to be responsible for their actions and their behaviour. We're all accountable to the golden rule. We are all accountable to treat others as we would want to be treated were we in the same circumstances. And this accountability within restorative theory is not simply being accountable to the structure that says you shouldn't do that and therefore we will punish you to show that you've been held accountable. Rather, it's being accountable for dealing with the consequences of what you have caused. Being accountable for putting things right again, for working to repair and to change things. And so this move that we've made towards restorative justice and our student conduct policy, for me, is just the tip of the iceberg. It's part of a much larger range of concerns around the quality of relationships we have as colleagues and as teachers at this university. Thank you.